Hi, I'm Alan Thurston, author of It Ain't So, Shoeless Joe Jackson's Story, which consists of a two-act play and an afterword where I attempt to the best of my ability to make the case for Shoeless Joe Jackson. This is part 3 of a multi-part video presentation. In this part, I will explain why I think Joe Jackson's grand jury testimony fits the profile of a false confession. It is my belief that Shoeless Joe Jackson was induced by Alfred Austrian to make a false confession. When Jackson met with the White Sox attorney, he must have been frightened, confused, and if not intoxicated, severely hungover after a night of heavy drinking. He described himself as being, quote, corked, but not quite drunk. The ballplayer has been described as relying too much on others for guidance. Teammate Shane O'Collins said the slugger was, quote, easily influenced. Baseball writer Hugh Fullerton described him as, quote, something of a boy himself. William Herzog writes, quote, it is no insult to Joe Jackson's intelligence to say that he was no match for the lawyer Alfred Austrian. William Lamb writes in his article, An Ever-Changing Story, Jackson's account of the World Series fix was specific regarding events that he was involved in, full of peculiar detail and highly incriminating, his claim of actually trying his best on the field notwithstanding. Jackson defenders confronting the issue usually try to explain away Shoeless Joe's grand jury testimony by describing it as no more than regurgitation of information supplied to him by his interrogators. The Jackson grand jury testimony, however, betrays nothing of the indicia of a false confession. Here is why. The essential component of the false confession is knowledge of the details of the underlying offense by those questioning the suspect. For if the questioner does not know what happened, how can he implant such information in the mind of someone else? When Joe Jackson was first confronted about his fixed involvement in the Austrian law office, his inquisitors had only limited information about the matter, end quote. I strongly disagree. As I explained in part 2 of my video presentation, it is unlikely that anyone in the world knew more about the details of the 1919 World Series fix than Alfred Austrian. As I also mentioned in part 2, Charles Comiskey, the White Sox owner, in his statement to the press when the Black Sox scandal broke, wrote, quote, immediately upon the conclusion of the 1919 series, I took all the facts that I had concerning the matter to my lawyer, Austrian, placed all the matter before him and advised him to spare nothing to uncover any wrongdoing that occurred during the series, end quote. Austrian himself was quoted in the New York Times September 29, 1920, after Jackson and Lefty Williams' grand jury testimony, quote, Mr. Comiskey and myself, as his counsel, have been working on this for a year. It's because of our investigation that the lid was blown off this scandal, end quote. Testifying at Joe's 1924 civil trial, Austrian was asked, question, did you continue to meet and talk to Mr. Comiskey during the course of this investigation? Answer, yes, sir, frequently. Question, and did he advise and consult with you concerning that work and the progress of it? Answer, he did. Question, that continued down to the time the investigation was discontinued? Austrian answered, and afterward. As Charles Fountain has written, quote, as the Black Sox story unfolded, nothing happened beyond Austrian's awareness, end quote. However, Lamb writes in his article, quote, Eddie Seacott supplied Austrian with none of the fixed specific details about the holdup of fixed payoffs blamed on the gambler Abitel, about the $5,000 delivered to Joe's hotel room by Lefty Williams prior to Game 5, that Jackson would reveal to the grand jury. In short, Jackson's detail-specific grand jury testimony could not have been implanted in his mind by Austrian or Assistant State's Attorney Rablago, because neither they nor Comiskey were aware of any such details at that time, end quote. Again, I totally disagree. Comiskey and Austrian had almost all the details of the fix within days of the ending of the 1919 World Series. Austrian knew about gambler Attell's double-crossing the Black Sox players because it was on the front page of newspapers across the country in the gambler Billy Maharg's interview on the very day that Jackson and Austrian met in the lawyer's office. It had also been described in a front-page article in the Chicago Tribune 3 days before, on September 25th, 1920. Regarding the $5,000 delivered to Joe's hotel room by Lefty Williams, Jackson's detractors have been skeptical about his claim that he took the bribe money to Comiskey's office the day after the series ended and tried to show the owner and had the door slammed in his face. However, Comiskey testified at Joe's civil trial that Shoeless Joe did go to his office, waited an hour, and the owner did not see him. Joe himself testified at his civil trial that he had talked about the bribe to team secretary Harry Grabner when he traveled to Georgia to try to sign the ball player to a 3-year contract in February of 1920. Jackson claimed he had asked Grabner why he had been so mean to him when he had tried to show Comiskey the money last October. Black Sox outfielder Happy Felsch, who was meeting with Comiskey when Shoeless Joe came to the White Sox owner's office the day after this 1919 series ended, Felsch testified under oath that Comiskey told him that, quote, he knew Williams got money and he knew that Williams gave Jackson money, end quote. I believe that when Shoeless Joe went to White Sox attorney Austrian's office on September 28, 1920, he was seeking to clear his name as he had attempted to do 10 months before. Jackson proclaimed his innocence to Judge Charles McDonald, who was presiding over the Cook County grand jury, during a telephone call that was very probably prearranged by lawyer Austrian. Joe panicked after being told by the jurist that he did not believe him. McDonald was undoubtedly influenced by the testimony earlier that day of star pitcher Eddie Seacott, who claimed Jackson was present at the initial meeting of the crooked players. As Richard Offshee and Richard Leo write in their article, The Decision to Confess Falsely, quote, both guilty and innocent suspects can be made to say, I did it, especially if they are told, as I believe Joe was by Austrian, that they will, quote, be unable to convince the prosecutor, judge, or jury of their innocence, end quote. Eddie Seacott had implicated him, claiming that Shoeless Joe had attended the first meeting of the Black Sox players at the Ansonia Hotel in New York City in mid-September 1919. As previously mentioned, Joe could not have been at that meeting since he had not yet been approached about participating in the plot. Austrian very likely reminded Joe that he had taken the gambler's money, deposited the bribe in the bank, and made withdrawals. Such accusations, false confession expert Saul Casson writes, are, quote, aimed at thrusting an offender into a state of despair, incentivizing them to cooperate. Offshee and Leo write, quote, an innocent individual may become more progressively distressed, confused, and desperate as he is told of evidence that incriminates him, end quote. Joe, who expressed concern about going to jail, was told by Austrian that he would be indicted in a few minutes and that he needed a lawyer, quote, damn bad. Jackson said Austrian told him that he could do him more good than any attorney Joe might hire. Shoeless Joe very likely pointed out that he had taken the bribe money to show Comiskey, but the team owner refused to see him. They had written a letter via his wife offering to return to Chicago to tell what he knew and to clear his name, but Comiskey did not respond. He also, I believe, very likely told Austrian that he had asked to be benched prior to the start of the 1919 World Series, the morning of Game 1. Quote, the version of events, as Herzog writes, that would prove Joe's innocence would expose Comiskey's complicity. Austrian had to convince Joe not to implicate the White Sox owner if he wanted them to help him stay out of jail. Since Seacott had named him and he had taken the gambler's money, he must confess or else risk being convicted at the very least of perjury if he insisted that he was innocent. Casson writes, interrogators, quote, arouse fear to facilitate persuasion, end quote, to convince someone like Joe that, quote, that confessing served his self-interest, end quote. since in all probability he would only be used as a witness. Kazan also writes, quote, innocent people, if desperate enough, would confess if they thought they would escape punishment, end quote. Joe was persuaded, I believe, that, quote, confession was not a big deal, end quote, as Austrian told him, quote, they weren't after the ball players, but wanted to trample the gamblers under their feet, end quote. Kazan also writes, quote, an investigator may try to delude a subject into reasoning that confessing is necessary because it is to his advantage. Once a suspect fully realizes his dismal situation, an investigator can influence him to admit guilt if he is led to believe that making an admission will improve his position, end quote. Austrian, I believe, told Joe to give the grand jury what they wanted, which was to punish the gamblers. The team would take care of him if he cooperated. Shoeless Joe must not say anything that would implicate Comiskey if he wanted them to help him stay out of jail. They would also protect him from the violent gamblers who would be angry if they found out that Jackson had taken their money and was not part of the plot. His wife Katie could also be in danger. According to Kazan, quote, expressions of remorse within the body of false confessions is all too common, quote, and apology reinforces the perception of guilt, end quote. Joe testified during his civil trial that he had said that he was, quote, ashamed of himself during his 1920 grand jury testimony because Austrian, quote, suggested he do so. Proved to me that he was coached by the White Sox attorney. Quote, whether he had done it or not, Donald Grobman, one of Joe's prominent biographers, wrote, quote, the only way out was to admit it and say he was sorry. If he did that, the club would stand by him, end quote. Kazan contends innocent suspects are often, quote, intensely stressed and befuddled, end quote, as I believe Jackson was during his meeting with Austrian. Why should he say he was sorry when he believed that he had done nothing wrong? He had, quote, discovered, as Offshee and Leo write, that being innocent means little, end quote. Shoeless Joe testified during his 1921 criminal trial that Austrian, quote, said that after confessing, nothing would be done with me and I could go anywhere, to the Portuguese islands if I wanted. I'd never be prosecuted and the only way I would be used is as a witness, end quote. Offshee and Leo quote another suspect who made a false confession who said, quote, I remember just wanting to get it over with, telling them whatever they wanted to hear, just so I could get out of there, end quote. According to Charles Fountain, quote, Jackson remembered Austrian telling him he was working with State's Attorney Rapogel and Judge McDonald, and if Joe told them what he knew, they would take care of him and let him go home, end quote. Seacott had gone home after testifying, and so could Joe. According to Offshee and Leo, quote, it is not uncommon for a suspect to report that an interrogator said he could go home after he confessed. The suspect might quite reasonably come to believe that once he agrees to the investigator's suggested story, he will be able to leave, end quote. At his criminal trial, Shoeless Joe testified, quote, all I wanted was to tell my story and get out. They promised me they wouldn't put me in a jailhouse or fine me or even indict me. Saul Kazan defines a false confession as being the result of, quote, techniques used during interrogations designed to break people down into a sense of complete despair before offering them one way out, a confession, end quote. Joe was so stressed that he is reported to have exploded at reporters as he was being led toward the grand jury room. He cursed the reporters, the gamblers, and baseball itself as the light bulbs from the reporters' cameras flashed in his eyes. I believe Austrian coached Joe to corroborate much of what was contained in the Chicago Tribune articles on September 25th and September 28th, 1920, such as the names of the gamblers involved, Dave Attell and Bill Burns, the double-crossing of the Black Sox players by Attell, and the planned distribution of the bribe money. In the Mahog interview, Eddie Seacott, and not Chick Gandil, appears to be the ringleader of the fix. I think it is possible that Austrian coached Joe to focus on Gandil as the ringleader, the instigator, the whole works of it, as Joe put it when he testified before the grand jury, and not Seacott. Gandil had retired after the 1919 season. Comiskey may well have hoped that he might be able to keep the star pitcher, Seacott, and other of the Black Sox players, that they would at worst be suspended for a time and not banned from organized baseball for life. Perhaps that might have happened had Comiskey's crony, Judge McDonald, been named the first commissioner of baseball and not Kennesaw Mountain Landis. There have been other players, particularly baseball star Hal Chase, who were known to be corrupt and yet were allowed to continue their careers. Even the revered Christy Mathewson, one of the greatest pitchers of all time, could not get rid of Chase when he managed the corrupt player when Mathewson managed the Cincinnati Reds in 1918. So it's very likely that Comiskey and the Black Sox players themselves believed they would not be banned from baseball for life. Austrian, after 2 to 3 hours of coaching, rushed Joe to the grand jury room, admitting during his interrogation by Jackson's civil trial attorney, James Shaw, that he was concerned that if Joe did not testify before the grand jury adjourned for the day, the ball player might possibly obtain legal counsel that would represent his interests and not those of Comiskey. Bill Beck opined that, quote, "To a man like Austrian, there is no right or wrong. There are only tactics, stratagems, techniques, and results," unquote. And how different the result may have been if Joe had had an attorney of his own who would have told him to testify to his truths and had his interests in mind instead of Comiskey. Austrian kept no notes during his meeting with Joe, as he had with Seacott and Williams. He had no fear of them. He and Comiskey did fear Joe, who could expose their cover-up, providing American League President Ban Johnson with all the information he would need to bring his mortal enemy, Charles Comiskey, down, drive him out of the game. Austrian escorted Jackson to grand jury Judge McDonald's chambers. Dr. David Fletcher stated during an interview with podcaster Nestor that Jackson, quote, "was guilty. There's no doubt about it. He took the money. When he confessed, he said he always played to win, but he did tell grand jury Judge McDonald that he didn't always play his hardest during the World Series," end quote. Joe never denied, and his supporters do not deny, that he took the money. The issue, as Judge Gregory stated in his charge to the jury at Jackson's civil trial, the issue is not that he took the money, it's when he took the money. William Lamb writes in his book, Black Sox in the Courtroom, quote, "Following his arrival in chambers, Jackson informed Judge McDonald that he had first been approached about participating in the World Series fix outside the Ansonia Hotel in New York City. Chick Gandil offered him $5,000, a sum rejected by Jackson as, quote, that wasn't enough to influence a laborer to do a dirty deed, end quote. According to newspaper accounts, McDonald did so testify in the Black Sox criminal trial in 1921. The judge stated he took no notes during his meetings with Joe Jackson and Lefty Williams, that he was testifying from memory. It is clear that the judge was confusing Joe with his teammate Lefty Williams, who testified before the grand jury on September 29, 1920, that it was he who was approached by Chick Gandil outside the Ansonia Hotel and offered $5,000. Williams responded by saying, quote, "That is not enough money for an ordinary working man to do a dirty deed." Lefty also said he could have pitched harder. Therefore, I would argue that nothing Judge McDonald said about Joe should be trusted, since he is so clearly confusing the two ball players. To conclude this part 3 of my video presentation, I would like to quote Donald Grobman, who asked a series of questions at the end of his book, Say It Ain't So, Joe. Quote, did Jackson have reason to believe that Austrian was his lawyer? Did Austrian have reason to believe that Jackson was proceeding under a mistaken assumption? And if so, did he do anything about it to clarify the matter? If Austrian was only Jackson's employer Comiskey's lawyer, then under what theory of a lawyer's duties and obligations did Austrian offer to and even force upon Jackson his legal advice? Lastly, and most concisely, did Austrian tell Jackson that he was Comiskey's lawyer and that therefore a conflict of interest prevented him from even discussing the matter with Jackson? Austrian, of course, did none of these things. Instead, he used the situation to entrap Jackson and to direct his actions for the sole benefit of his only client in the matter, Charles Comiskey. And part 3.